good evening and welcome to tonight's program presented jointly by the Pritzker Military Museum and Library and International Spy Museum. I'm Liz Eberlein, Associate Director of Programs at the Pritzker Military Museum and Library in Chicago, and we thank you for being with us this evening. We hope that your weather is a little bit better than it is in DC and Chicago. The Pritzker Military Museum and Library and the Spy Museum share strong educational missions. The International Spy Museum's mission is to educate the public about espionage and intelligence in an engaging way and to provide a context for understanding of the important role intelligence has played in history and continues to play today. And they're committed to the apolitical presentation of espionage in order to provide visitors with impartial, accurate information. The Pritzker Military Museum and Library is centered around our mission to increase the public's understanding of military history, military affairs, and national security, as well as how military service and the sacrifices made by the men and women who have worn the uniform have shaped our country's democracy. And we are delighted that the missions of these two organizations have aligned to make tonight's program possible. When the second largest ship in the world, the SS Normandie, caught fire on the Hudson River and sank, many suspected sabotage. This fear led to an unusual alliance. In the face of saboteurs, spies, and enemies of the state on the New York shoreline, the US Navy did the unthinkable and empowered the New York Mafia to help them patrol the New York City docks and act as informants. With us this evening to talk about this clandestine coalition is journalist and labor and crime historian Matthew Black. Matthew will be joined in a bit by the Spy Museum's Director of Adult Education, Amanda Olke. Matthew, welcome, and thanks so much for being here tonight to share this fascinating story with us.
Thank you so much, Liz, and thank you to the Pritzker Military Museum and Library for putting this on, and thank you so much, Amanda, and to the Spy Museum as well, a place that I visited several times before and always enjoy. And last but not least, thank you to all of you out there who've come to listen to an extraordinary story filled with sailors, gangsters, G-men, saboteurs, and of course, spies. Who is Agent X? What is the identity of Agent Y? Who is Agent George? And what is a surreptitious entry? These are some of the questions that I started with when I began researching for Operation Underworld. These men, these secret agents, and the missions they were part of were covered up by the government and were a closely held secret for over 80 years, until now. Operation Underworld starts with an extraordinary event. Just 2 months after Pearl Harbor, on February 9th, 1942, during a cold morning on the west side of Manhattan, SS Normandie, the second largest ship in the world, was docked on the Hudson River when a fire broke out and quickly consumed the top deck of the behemoth ship. Though the fire department was successful in extinguishing the blaze after a battle that lasted the entire day, they hurled so much water on board that the ship became unstable and eventually capsized to port and settled into the muddy banks of the river. One of the most important ships in the Atlantic fleet was lost, and people immediately began to wonder, had it been sabotaged? In the context of the Battle of the Atlantic in the early years of US involvement in World War II, Normandy was another tremendous loss in a series of catastrophic events. The US was losing almost 2 ships a day to German U-boats, including the oil tanker Dixie Arrow, shown here, that cracked in half after being struck by 3 torpedoes just miles off the East Coast. The ships were being lost with such frequency that there was a deep fear that somehow enemy spies from the mainland were transmitting ship movements and information to U-boat captains at sea. To investigate several leads that led the Navy's secret agents all over New York City, an outside-the-box thinker named Lieutenant Commander Charles Radcliffe Haffenden from Naval Intelligence did an incredible thing. He recruited men from the Mafia and formed an alliance with some of the worst criminals in the country to gain access to areas that he could not infiltrate. Once the alliance had been secured and he could go anywhere on the waterfront or in Manhattan proper, Haffenden recruited a team of specialists with varying sets of skills. For the first time, we now know who these people are and why they were recruited. Agent X was a civilian named Dominic Seiko, and he had run a private investigative practice for decades. He was also Commander Haffenden's best friend and most trusted advisor. During his participation in Operation Underworld, he conducted top secret missions, all while assuming various false identities at war production plants, waterfront operations, and buildings in downtown Manhattan. Agent Y was another civilian named Felix Seco, and he was Dominic Seco's younger brother, and he was a friend of Haffenden as well. Felix Seco was also a private investigator, and he also had a very important special set of skills that made him invaluable to missions in downtown Manhattan. He had taught himself the art of lockpicking. This book is the first revealing of these two men's involvement and their identities. Previously, they were only known as Agent X and Agent Y. Agent George had previously been identified, and he was on the team because he was a safecracker and self-admitted professional burglar. But long before Operation Underworld, he began to use his skills for the side of good. And being on the side of good, when he conducted burglaries, the Navy adopted a law enforcement term, surreptitious entry. The reading I'm about to conduct is taken from one of these surreptitious entries. Whenever Haffenden had a job to do, he was not interested in sharing responsibility. That included his oversight of extremely risky, top-secret missions. Surveillance of the consulate's consul general himself hadn't even begun prior to the first surreptitious entry. His habits, his comings and goings were entirely unknown. This put Haffenden on edge, and to add to the tension, he told Lieutenant Kelly that if someone tried to detain them at the consulate, they were to use whatever means necessary, even if that meant violence, to prevent being apprehended. Haffenden was freelancing, after all. He had no official clearance from the Navy for what he was about to do, so only the officers were armed, some with small revolvers, and others with single-shot pencil-type gas guns. The night of the first mission, Haffenden could only wait a couple blocks away at the Hotel Astor as his team made their surreptitious entry in the dark. On nights like these, his heart raced, and he felt a pain in his stomach that made him think he had an ulcer. Gaining access to the building came care of the night superintendent, who left the door unlocked, but did have a condition. The elevator had to be operated by a member of the elevator union. Thanks to Sox Lanza, Dominic Seco carried just such a credential, as he had been designated by Book 33529, issued by the Building Service Employees International Union, Local 32B, with a current stamp for the month of June. Two junior grade lieutenants named Boynton and Smith stayed in the lobby, while the rest of Squad Number 3 filed into a freight elevator. Boynton and Smith had orders to intercept the Consul General if he were to suddenly arrive. Two more lieutenant junior grades joined Kelly Alfieri, the Seco brothers, Agent George, two other civilian agents, two chief yeomen, and three boatswain's mates as they entered the consulate's office and immediately began hanging blackout shades over the windows. Felix Seco had an easy time using a metal pick that was flat at the end to bypass the 4-pin file cabinet and desk locks. Seco took the time to show his methods to Alfieri, who was an eager learner. Cabinets and desk drawers were opening up all over the office. Soon, a number of men were sketching pictures of the inside of drawers so everything could be put back like it was found. Once this was accomplished, the photographer became busy snapping photos of documents. Alfieri had an equal interest in lockpicking as he did in safecracking. As Agent George took a crack at the main vault, he also took the time to show Alfieri how to do it. Finally, after a long process, George actually managed to open the safe. In it, there was an envelope that looked important, with writing on the outside. Alfieri read, "Secreta, solo para ser abierto en caso de guerra." Translation, secret, only to be opened in the case of war. They dared not open it, lest they leave evidence that they had been there. So they took a picture of the envelope, put it back, and closed the safe. George then spun the dial, counterclockwise to clear it, and placed the dial on the exact number it had been when he arrived. Now, Commander Haffinden's team of specialists conducted no less than 50 surreptitious entries similar to this one during the course of the early years of World War II. And given our talk today with spy and military enthusiasts, I thought that this would be a great place to start. Amanda, I'm happy to field any questions you might have.
Yes. Thank you for setting us up, Matthew. And,
Sure.
I've enjoyed very much reading my advanced copy. And So I had some basic questions and then some more detailed ones, but I have a feeling our audience is going to go nuts because this is such intriguing subject matter. But right off the bat, how were you able to find out the identities of the secret agents?
Yeah, well, it had been a closely held secret for years because, there had been a massive cover up after the fact. And the only reason why we really know anything about Operation Underworld is because there was an investigation years later. And Agent X, Agent Y, the Seiko brothers, didn't want to have anything to do with this investigation. We don't know exactly why that is, whether they were in shame of something they did. They certainly committed a number of crimes during the course of the operation. Also, these were esoteric men to begin with. They were private investigators, used to surveillance and not being seen. So the investigators made a condition that they would not release their names when the report came out. And so the two men agreed to testify. So when the report came out, it did not include their names. And then it was classified for another 25 years. When it was declassified, the writer who was tasked with writing a book about the declassified material neglected to mention who they were. And given the obviousness of who they were, I mean, it took some digging to make it happen, but going through all the material in the investigation, I can only come to the conclusion that he did that on purpose. And I assume that he did that on purpose to protect their memory, to protect their image, because that's what they wanted. These two men have been deceased for nearly 50 years. I think it's time we can tell their story.
So a lot of fun detective work on your end. How were you able to find out what they were doing during their surreptitious entries?
Yeah, so Agent George, I don't know if you could tell by his photo, he's quite a character. Self-proclaimed burglar. He's had a lot of adventures, and in 1946, just a year after the war, he published a memoir titled Surreptitious Entry. I mean, it's a rare of rare books. There are not many copies out there. But in it, he goes through these missions that they conducted in New York City during World War II. And it's fascinating stuff. He was allowed to write about it because it seems that, Operation Underworld was covered up for so many years because of the involvement with the mafia. Now, Agent George, he was heavily involved in Operation Underworld, but he may not even have known that it was mafia informants that got them access to this building that he was breaking into, because he doesn't speak of it in the book. And maybe he omitted that because he didn't want to reveal classified material, but it's also possible he didn't even know. So yeah, his book was a big inspiration.
I'm gonna jump to an audience question before more of mine, because someone asked in particular about how the Sacco brothers were recruited.
Yeah, and I was able to answer that question, and really when I set out to write this book, I'm like, I really need to be able to answer these, or what's the point? And so so I mentioned that Haffenden his best friend was Dominic Seiko, and his brother was obviously Felix. And in the investigation, I believe they knew each other since the mid-20s. So it had been a while, and it's an interesting thing. Haffenden was part of this New York social group called the Executives Association. And what it was a collection of private investigators, well, not just private investigators, but investigators, and they rubbed shoulders with each other, they traded work, they told stories, and they were all under the tutelage of a former president of theirs named Raymond Schindler. Not to be confused with, Schindler of Schindler's List or anything. But he is, if you look him up, he's actually quite famous in his own right. He's English. He had a number of very high profile cases that he cracked. And Haffenden sort of idolized him, but I don't want to digress from that. Haffenden was able to get himself involved in this group, even though he was not an investigator himself. But Dominic and Felix Seiko were part of that community, and that's where they met and spent time and developed a friendship. And then when when the war came on, I think it was 1940, early 1941, just before the U.S. involvement, Haffenden was put on active service in Office of Naval Intelligence, given command of a section, and told to recruit men for these missions. And these are the two men he came up with first.
So Haffenden was so very savvy in my eyes about knowing how he wanted to get eyes and legs and everything else on the New York waterfront. I mean, he felt like he really understood that he needed to make contact with the people who are calling the shots. And how do you think, and we know who that, we'll talk more about who that turns out to be, but how do you think he came up with this idea?
Yeah, I think, okay, so, we're kind of getting an idea of his team now. I talked about the private investigators that were on his team and their role. He also had several members of the district attorney's office of Manhattan in his group as well. And these men were not civilian agents who were conducting surreptitious entries. These were officers in the Navy. And of course, they were intelligence officers, and they did some things that we don't know about fully. But when his men went to the waterfront, for example, there was no cooperation whatsoever from the people who work there. So if you were trying to secure a pier or the port of New York, something big like that, and there were several vulnerable points where the ships were being loaded, how cargo was being transferred, and you're relying on civilians to load this cargo, the longshoremen. It definitely creates a situation where we needed to get agents, we need to get boots on the ground to see if there was anything going on there. There was no infiltration possible because these people were taught to be D&D or deaf and dumb. They were not to cooperate with any law enforcement whatsoever. And if they did, it really literally could mean their life. That's what they grew up, because their bosses were members of the mafia and you just didn't talk about them. So for Haffenden, he could ask the question, why are we not able to gain any cooperation from these folks on the waterfront? There is a war on. Everybody seems to be falling into line and cooperating. Why will they not? Well, his men who were all, came from the district attorney's office could tell him very well who the bosses were down on the waterfront. It was the mafia. So the first step, that they took after the Normandy fire was to contact the district attorney's office and see if they could find a member of the mafia that would be willing to help them.
And do you want to share how big the fish were that Haffenden ended up getting in contact with?
Sure. Yeah, of course. So, he kind of starts with a mid-level gangster named Sox Lanza, who's like a bit of a bruiser. He's got his own territory of Fulton Fish Market on on Lower Manhattan. And he's very helpful, but he's only able to get them so far.
Matthew, I'm going to interrupt you because Sox Lanza's great nickname. I have told so many people as I was reading the book over the weekend, it's not because he wore colorful socks.
Right.
Tell him where his nickname came from.
Yeah, sorry. His name is Joe Lanza. He's Joe Sox Lanza. He got his nickname because he'll sock. If you get in a disagreement with you, he'll be fine punching you. He'll be fine punching you with brass knuckles, or he might even hit you with a giant fish.
Yes, the fish is especially special.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So, Sox was not very successful, and he was completely unsuccessful in helping the Navy in areas like the Upper West Side, where the Normandy had gone down, because there were Irish gangs who ran those piers. He couldn't do anything in Brooklyn because there was a different Italian mafia family that ran that. There were also native Italians who didn't want to talk to him. And so when you try to think about opening up all the doors that they need to open, they needed someone, and the quote is, to snap the whip on the entire underworld. And that man was Lucky Luciano. And Lucky Luciano, he's one of Time Magazine's 20th century's most influential people because he is the man who organized crime. But the twist of it is that, and this isn't a twist in the book, you'll find this, but the twist of it is that he is in jail at the time that this is all going on. So, how can he really help? Well, Meyer Lansky, another big name in the mafia, Jewish gangster, but he's also affiliated with the Italian mafia. He's often referred to as the mob's accountant. He was responsible for recruiting Lucky Luciano into the picture, and it's very possible, given the evidence that we had, that Luciano would not have gone along with it if Meyer Lansky hadn't approached him first. So. There's also some big name. I'll go ahead and name drop. That's fine.
Everybody's here for that.
Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah, no, there's other big names that are involved. And being involved in Operation Underworld gave Luciano unprecedented access to his capos. So you'll hear names like Frank Costello, who's a character. You'll hear names like Bugsy Siegel, who visits Luciano in prison. There's Willie Moretti, Joe Adonis, all part of this operation, and it makes for very interesting reading and storytelling to be able to include these guys as characters.
I got quite an education reading the book. I'm used to the intelligence world and enjoyed that part a lot, but I really understand now why they call it organized crime. It was really fascinating. This is a great, you get a twofer here. You really get a background in the origins, of organized crime, and it's fascinating. And then this overlap here with our friend Commander Heffenden. How do you think he gets very comfortable with the mafia? How do you think that happened?
Yeah, well, it's something that investigators would confront for decades after. And I don't go into this in Operation Underworld because I want the reader to be in the moment, but undercover agents, have, the propensity to get a little too, I don't want to say that it's common, but it can happen where they get a little too close to the people that they're working with and maybe even to start adopting their habits. And, for Commander Heffenden, he was full of ambition. But prior to the war, he really had not achieved what he, had set out to do in his life. And he saw Operation Underworld as an opportunity to define his legacy. And he also began to see that there would be life after the war. And he also was, speaking of some other, societies within and groups within New York and Manhattan, he was a Tammany Hall member, and they were the Democratic powerhouse in New York City. And Joe Sox Lanza was a member of Tammany Hall. There's incidents during the book, in the course of the book, where I talk about how Frank Costello rigged elections, on behalf of Tammany Hall. So Tammany is this, extremely corrupt organization that Heffenden, a reputable naval officer, is a part of. And after the war, the relationship that he develops with the mafia does culminate into something for him. I won't tell you what, but yeah, I mean, he was very comfortable with it all, and definitely led to some questionable activity on his part.
A lot of lobster for breakfast.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, from courtesy of Joe Sox Lanza. Given he was at Fulton Fish Market, he realized Commander Heffenden had a taste for the lobsters, so he was happy to supply it often.
I can't believe any of them made old bones. And we have great audience questions coming in, but I'm going to stick with a few more that we discussed in advance. What do you think was Heffenden's biggest win?
Yeah, I think his biggest win was recruiting Lucky Luciano into Operation Underworld. I really do. You gave me that question. I thought about it, a while. And yeah, no, it really was an incredible feat. And as questionable as the practice was, and you'll see the conflict that if you read, you'll see the conflict that, even his own officers go through in recruiting such a man to help. Nobody, I just can't imagine there would be too many people in his position who would have even thought of that in the first place. or would have even actually entertained it as is an idea, but going back to snap the whip on the entire underworld, there was only one man, in New York there's only one man in the world, excuse me, who could bring together Irish gangs on the West Side, Luciano crime family in Manhattan, and Mangiano family, in Brooklyn. They were all factions, kind of gangs in New York style. This is an era that's just, getting past that, or crime has only just been organized, and there's still plenty of factions out there. But that's one of the traits of Luciano. And, he didn't go on a blood murdering rampage, and then declare himself king. He got to the top and then spread the wealth and was happy to work with anyone, no matter what their racial background was, as long as they were committed to the goal of making money. That's what it was all about.
It very, very interesting, very nuanced characters. And I know, skipping over to an audience question, because this is such an intriguing part, what they wanted. What did the gangsters, what did they get in return for working?
Yeah, for sure. It would be very unremarkable if the gangsters just, cooperated with the government, in exchange for, time off or something like that. But it really wasn't the case. In Joe Sox Lanza's case, he was under indictment. When when the Manhattan district attorney referred him to naval intelligence, he was under indictment and facing a 7 to 15 year prison sentence. He had already, served 2 long terms in prison. The scam that he got caught for had been going on for like 7 years. And so you would think you could just offer this man a deal and a help. Well, the district attorney and him and his lawyer met. I love the meeting, very cloak and dagger at midnight in Riverside Park in the dark. They had to go to a place where nobody would recognize them. And in the shadow of Grant's tomb, they talk about the fact that, you're not getting anything in return for this. You owe this to your country. This is why you need to do this. And Lanza was considered a patriot, I guess, beforehand. That's why he was recruited. He was outspoken, loved his country. And then in the case of Luciano, there's no evidence that he was given a deal in order to, for his participation in Operation Underworld. In fact, there's very many parts that are adamant about the fact that he was not, offered a deal. But Meyer Lansky did say to investigators later that, he told them that it couldn't hurt his chances of getting a deal. I mean, he was 6 years into a 30-year minimum sentence. If it could help grease the wheels and an early parole, he was open to it. But he had his own reasons for being resistant to it, and you'll just have to read to find that out.
We won't spoil that one. That's an interesting piece. Well, I'm going to give you another one of my challenges. There's so many interesting stories embedded in this crazy tale. Do you have a favorite?
Yeah, I do. It probably won't come out as a reader favorite or anything, but maybe when you do read it, you'll think of what I'm talking about here. But there's a scene. Okay, so let me skip forward a little bit where the book is Operation Underworld: How the Mafia and the U.S. government teamed to win World War II. Okay, well, you don't win a war by just securing the homeland. This book does take you into the fight to the enemy. And intelligence gathering for our first major offensive in Europe, which was in Sicily, began right in New York City. New York City had more Italians in the world anywhere except for Italy, of course. And that was a massive network of people that we could gather intelligence from. And what the Navy did was they had another room of secret agents. Agent Tarbox was a map maker, and there was a whole room full of map makers. And they were trying to take whatever intelligence they could gather from these people, whatever data they could compile, and create create something that would be usable for military commanders on the ground. Because believe it or not, the Navy had, destroyed their data from the last war and were using maps purchased from Rand McNally to make war plans. So that doesn't give you any indication of, fortifications or garrisons or, what the minds and hearts of the people are on the ground, how to connect with them. So there's this scene where some of these Italians are brought by some of the gangsters into this map making room. And I had to put it together from like 15 different people's testimonies to figure out what was going on, in this scene. It was just like, I could take, right up until, close to publication, I didn't even know what the maps were, what they were hung on, like, were they mounted, were they in drawers, were they on the wall, and then, this one test, I poured through it and found it. I was like, oh, thank God. So anyway, yeah, that scene I really love because it's just pulled from so many little pieces of information from so many different testimonies.
Ask me what my favorite thing is.
Amanda, what's your favorite part?
I like that sliced bread is a total red herring in this book. And so folks have to read it and find out about that.
That's a really cool piece of intelligence, right?
I love that. Okay, so much of this is so cinematic and the way you set it up, and it's very visual as you're talking about Graham's tomb. Well, for me, you kept talking about Heffernan's spy master boss in DC. And I was very far through the book and I thought, well, will we ever know who it is? And he hasn't, maybe he doesn't, maybe Matthew doesn't know. Maybe it's a secret. He's this shadowy figure. And then you reveal his name to be Wallace Wharton. And I'm wondering, can you tell us more about this figure? Is he somebody special in naval intelligence?
Yeah, yes, he is. And he was another name that was withheld previously. And this book is the first time that his name has been mentioned in connection with Operation Underworld. He was a known figure throughout naval intelligence, but not his connection to this. If you go to the U.S. Naval Institute website and look up his name, there are several reports that he wrote during World War II. And you could just tell that he was the brains behind a lot of major decisions. He even wrote a report that uncovered what appeared to be an international plot by Axis powers to sabotage world industry by monopolizing certain processes and parts. And I've never heard of this stuff before. And I will say, unfortunately, not a ton of it is included in the book because there's not a lot of connection to Operation Underworld. But yeah, I mean, if you wanted to read more about him, he's a very interesting case study for sure.
Yeah, you must have 7 new books you want to write because of this book.
Yeah.
And of course, I was obsessing about a really interesting scene. Everybody who knows me knows I love my female spies, my women spies. And there is a flaps and seals expert from MI6. She comes in to open and reclose a sealed letter that was borrowed during one of those surreptitious entries. And so how did you find out about her?
Yeah. So the envelope that Amanda's talking about is the one that was referenced in the reading that I had started this program with. And I found out about her through Agent George's book, Surreptitious Entry. And I'm going to go ahead and read the part. It's really awesome. So, all right. Despite all the law enforcement agencies and intelligence outfits in the United States, it turned out to be MI6, British intelligence, who were going to fly in a specialist to help. When it was mission time again, the specialist from MI6 joined squad number 3. The men were surprised to learn that not only was this agent British, but she was also a woman. She was in her mid-50s with an athletic build, and she was not one for conversation. Agent George wasn't impressed with her personality, but her gear certainly made an impression on him, as it took 2 sailors to carry her incredible assortment of electric burners, pots, pans, and tea kettles. After the team had entered the consulate's office a 3rd time, the specialist from MI6 waited patiently until Agent George had opened the safe once again. The agent from MI6 heated up water in one of her electric tea kettles, which had a long, thin spout. As the water reached a boil, the spout began to emit steam, and she was then ready to take it to the envelope. Calmly, she brought the steam into contact with the envelope flap and began the slow process of melting the glue that held the flap down. Once a part of the flap was separated from the rest of the envelope, she moved the spout in and out of the void, but not for too long, so as to avoid damaging the contents or the envelope itself. After 30 agonizing minutes, the envelope was open, and the men breathed a collective sigh of relief. Yeah, I love that part too.
I love it so much. And we have an object that it's a wooden spool and it has 2 wire pieces, and it was used, you inserted it to roll a letter out, as I recall. And I mean, I'm just fascinated by this bureau of folks, especially in Bermuda. There were all these folks reading mail. So.
That's right. Yeah, and I looked into that. I was trying to find this woman.
I know she remains. Her name is lost to us, I assume.
Right.
Yeah, very, very cool. Well, so jumping over to some of the audience questions, there is concern. Wasn't the Navy concerned that there would be information flowing to Italy? Italy's, an Axis power. So how did they get comfort with the thought that these are Italian, some people born in Italy, like Luciano?
Right. That's a good question. There's a lot to that. When the war first started, many of the longshoremen in New York, the port of New York, in and around the area, were immigrants from Italy, non-naturalized citizens. And President Roosevelt actually took the unfortunate step of declaring them possible enemies of the state. So with that attitude, you weren't going to be recruiting any Italians, to help you out. And certainly maybe they would have ties, to their mother country. But of course, just like Haffenden, needed to learn about how the waterfront was run, they also needed to learn about the state of the Italians that were in New York. And there did seem to be a lot of love lost between the Italians who had come to the United States and the regime that had taken over in Italy, the fascist regime that was run by Benito Mussolini, Il Duce. So Operation Underworld went on for, maybe a year, and then it morphed into the beginnings of Operation Husky, which was the invasion into Sicily. So by this time, naval intelligence had a really good idea of who these people were and where their loyalties lie. And there were a lot of people, that really helped them. And furthermore, I guess, communication between Italy and the United States had really been cut off. And one of the reasons I know this is because the rackets that the mafia conducted, especially drug smuggling and drug operations, were out of Italy. Well, the regime there shut that down. So, they were left without that big, money source because it was too risky to run the gauntlet of the Atlantic, and port securities in Italy and in the United States were insane at the time. So that racket shut down. So there just wasn't a lot of communication going on between those countries at that time.
Yeah, one of our savvy guests wanted to know if you cover what Luciano did in regards to Sicily.
Yeah, definitely. And there's a story. I'll go ahead and tell it because it didn't actually happen. But there is a story that Luciano was dropped in as a paratrooper with the first wave of paratroopers behind enemy lines in Sicily. And of course, the thinking is Luciano could make contacts with the mafia there, and turn them against the invaders. Well, a lot of that, okay, as absurd as that sounds, a lot of that was born in truth. First of all, that was a tactic that the military planners certainly adopted, and they actually plucked men right out of Operation Underworld to be the first, the first boots on the ground in Sicily, so that they could contact the people in the mafia and get them to turn on their German occupiers. And then for Luciano, and this goes back to Wallace Wharton. I think this is the scene where he's actually, we actually learn his name. We know about that incident because he, in his testimony in the Hurley investigation that came later, he speaks of an incident where, Haffenden, came to Washington, D.C. to the spy master to suggest that it would be a great idea if they got Luciano out of prison and parachuted him into Sicily, and in 1947, it was even a writer named Walter Winchell said that Luciano had been up for the Congressional Medal of Honor, which is pretty absurd, but kind of born in some truth there, because there were some events in that. But there are a lot of rumors, that he was on the ground and he was in the battles. But I'll tell you, you do get the real story of how he helped. Even though he's in jail, he's supplying intelligence, and he's also certainly taken advantage of the time to talk with his capos as well to further his criminal aims.
Oh, very, very clever, working all the angles as one would expect. Someone asked, wasn't he deported after the war?
Yes, he was. I'm comfortable saying that because most people, well, not most people, a lot of people know that about him. When after the war, he had been trying to get out of jail the entire time, and you'll go through these different efforts there. He tries to get paroled. And then there's this kind of instance where he tries to bribe the guy who put him away, Thomas Dewey, who was the district attorney at the time, and later became governor of New York. And I contend in the book, that a bribe certainly was offered, but, I don't believe a man like Thomas Dewey would take it. And there's no evidence that he did. But Thomas Dewey was integral to Luciano getting out of prison, even though he was the man who put him away. So, they get the notion that he may, grant some sort of clemency for him, and they put all their eggs into, into that basket to trying to nudge him to do that. And then when he does get out, he wanted to go back to New York. He that's where he wanted to live. He didn't want to get paroled if it meant that he was going to go back to Italy, and that's one of the things too. And, he could not, he had to be careful. He couldn't be paroled during the war. If he helps out the United States and then gets paroled and deported, the Italian government is probably not going to let him live.
It was really some difficult decisions to make and, keep track of. And I like you have the odds constantly being offered as to, what's the best next move.
I could tell that was like secret language between Lansky and Luciano, because they're so into gambling, and Lansky's this mathematical brain. And he knows how to speak to Luciano, 10-1, this helps you get out of prison, that sort of thing.
I'd always be like, is that good or bad?
Yeah, right.
Well, were the gangsters proud of their involvement with Underworld?
Yeah, I think, well, okay, it's a mixed bag there. Let's just talk about a few of the characters that we mentioned. Joe Sox Lanza would have been extremely happy with his involvement in Operation Underworld. He was a patriotic man. He was very active in politics, both good and bad. He loved his country. Meyer Lansky, I'm very sure he would have also been very proud of his service as well. Maybe, of course, in service to his country, but certainly in service, to his race. And, as a man of Jewish faith, he was combating fascism in New York City not long before World War II, but before World War II. when neo-Nazi groups were they weren't neo-Nazi, excuse me, when Nazi groups were forming in Manhattan, he was he was getting together groups of thugs to go fight them and break up their gatherings, and then Luciano, I would say probably not so happy with his involvement in the war and helping the government. He did not get the result that he wanted out of his for giving his help.
We had a question really early on about whether any of the mafia who helped rose up higher in the various families later. I mean, many of them were already pretty high up, clearly,
right.
But did anybody else go on and become a big deal?
Yeah, Meyer Lansky was pretty firmly established. Frank Costello was an underboss. He eventually, or acting boss, excuse me, underboss, acting boss. He eventually became boss. And then Sox Lanza, we know that he became a capo at some point, a boss in the family. There's usually only a handful of those. We just don't know exactly when it happened. And given the evidence, it doesn't seem like it happened until after his involvement in Operation Underworld. He ended up having a long stay in prison, and afterward he got promoted. And let's see who else. Well, and just in general, there was this kind of conclusion and fear that by involving the mafia in this, and this especially happened in Italy, that we were empowering them, in their positions and to solidify, their territories. And, in Italy, it did have that unintended consequence where we needed the Italian people to rise up, against the German occupiers. But when they did that, there were tons of voids in leadership in the towns and locales, and the mafia just immediately, stepped into those, and good luck trying to get them out. They're not going to give it. They're not going to give up their position,
Okay, we have one question to rule them all. You cannot imagine how many questions, Matthew, about,
oh, wow, wonderful.
Have you sold the movie rights yet? Who do you want to play who? So there's so many movie questions, and you do set great scenes. So tell us, we want to know.
I really want to reveal more than I can here, but I will tell you that I have sold the movie rights. I'm very much hoping the people who bought it are very motivated. They seem to be, which is nice. And I've given it a lot of thought. I think I would love to see Tom Hanks play Commander Haffenden and Leonardo DiCaprio to play Lucky Luciano. So.
I think that's pretty good casting.
Yeah, pretty good. I know I should be the casting director when it gets made. No, I'll make all the right decisions.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh.
I think it would make a great, Netflix short series type. So hope it.
It's so juicy. You can do a lot with it. Now, I love the history buffs who are really paying close attention. And one of our guests wants to know, did the mob connection reveal anything about the Normandy fire? So taking it all the way back to your presentation at the start.
Yeah, and I don't really go into this in the book, but perhaps this person is referencing something that came out in Lucky Luciano's memoir, The Last Testament of Lucky Luciano. Now, a lot of folks think that Alberto Anastasia was a big part of Operation Underworld. He was a Brooklyn-based gangster. But the thing is he was, prior to Operation Underworld, he was on the run for 2 years and nobody had seen him. And then when the war started, they managed to get to a witness who could have implicated him. And so they got to him, they kill him. And then Anastasia immediately joins the army to kind of lie low, stay out of the crosshairs. But Luciano claims, and I think Meyer Lansky backs him up on this, that it was Anastasia who started the fire on the Normandy. And the thinking was that if they could convince the Navy that there was a security problem in the port of New York, that they would immediately go to someone like Lansky or Luciano to try and secure it. I think, that's a huge leap. And a lot of historians have really come down on that. But it appears that the initial investigation, and you can read about it in the book, was correct. And then they did do another investigation in 1951 to challenge the findings. I think it was 51. And they concluded the same thing. So nothing about the mafia involvement made us understand more about that.
Simple question. Why weren't these men drafted?
That is a great question. That is such a great question, because I had to ask that myself. Well, if you notice the photos of Agent X and Agent Y, they're not young men. Yeah, they're, I think they're in their 50s, at the time of Operation Underworld. And that didn't quite get to me at first. I was like, well, they knew Halfenden, but then you start looking at some of the officers that are involved. And, one in particular is civilian agent Alfieri, who was in that scene that I had previously read. And he started off as a civilian agent, and he was over 40. And then he gets a commission as an officer. And just basically the fact of the matter is the initial recruitment standards, and I can't remember them off the top of my head, but I think it cut off at like 32 years old. Once you were over 32, you were, 4F, you were not, eligible to be drafted, and of course those rules kind of relaxed as the war went on. But, these men were already heavily involved in what they were doing. So that's the main reason why most of these guys weren't, drafted in the first place.
And someone wants to know, were there similar efforts to infiltrate the German and Irish dock workers?
Yes. Yeah. Definitely, especially in the case of the Irish who were on the Upper West Side and where Normandy burned. There was a very scary looking gangster. Not only scary looking, he was very scary. His name was Johnny Cockeye Dunn. Cockeye is his nickname. You look at a picture of him, and it's in the book, you'll see why they call him Cockeye. And him and his partner, Eddie McGrath, who was also being charged with murder while he was helping out with Operation Underworld. He was, he had been charged in the state of Florida and was cooperating with the government. We were happy to, do that. So recruiting them was of the utmost importance, and the whole, International Longswordmen Association Union, which had a lot of, Irish members in it. So certainly in that case, they were involved. And, just as a little nugget, Johnny Dunn ended up getting convicted of murder shortly after World War II and was killed in the electric chair at Sing Sing prison.
I mean, there were just, threads going everywhere from the book. Now I want to tell you, our audience, they are good book readers and buyers. So I don't want you to think you're giving away the farm, especially because this question, which is something I'd love to talk about, we just have a couple of minutes left, but was any other sabotage prevented or interrupted by the relationship between the Navy and the mob? And you tell some really interesting stuff out on Long Island. Yeah,
definitely. One of the hard parts is if if an event doesn't happen, how do you know about it? And that's the thing about naval intelligence. Their job is to not, address the threat. They're there to prevent the threat from, coming to fruition. On Long Island, there was a case where the Germans actually landed troops on the ground. And mainland, or not mainland, but on the United States soil. A U-boat surfaced, and they posed as fishermen. They were on a rowboat in swimming gear, came in the dark, were confronted by a Coast Guardsman, threatened him, paid him off, and then caught a train to Manhattan. They had explosives, they had money, they had training. And Commander Halfenden was one of the first people on the scene. And so, they go to Long Island. They talked to the Coast Guardman who confronted them. And, it's his agents that actually find a key piece of information, for where these Germans ended up. So, these guys had plans to blow up the Hell's Gate Bridge. They had several war production plants in their targets. They had enough explosives to carry out 2 years worth of operations. So in the end, the FBI does apprehend these men, and that's why you don't hear about any, war production plants being blown up or anything like that. But what you also don't, what you don't hear about is how naval intelligence was, involved in tracking these men down.
That is just fascinating and another incredible cinematic moment.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, I think it's time.
Yeah. Well, I just have one last little thing to share. To all you sleuths out there, or anyone who wants to discover some history. So, the reason why this story has taken so long to come out, I spoke to it, before, that, there was a massive cover up by the Navy. It was classified and then reclassified. The Navy took the step of burning all the documents and information related to Operation Underworld. And it was an investigation that happened later to what we know so much. But, it's a sad thing for me. I hate to think of historical documents that we could have learned so much from, lost to government incinerators.
People were mad in the chat about that all the maps after World War I.
Yeah. Why? Yeah. Well, we have much better data storage abilities these days, I suppose. So, so in the course of my research, I found one single page document that actually looks like it may have been in or around a fire. It gives the entire roster of names from squad number 3 and the other 6 squads under Haffinden's command. Nobody has ever identified the agents that are on these lists, nor the jobs they conducted during their missions. I invite you to visit my website. It's operationunderworldbook.com and visit the Learn More page. There you will find an image of the document for all the world to see. If you match the names on the roster with the third from last image in the photo section of the book, then you'll have their picture too. So you have their name and you have their picture. And so I just feel like history should be shared and not hidden nor destroyed. And to live those words instead of saying them, I offer this previously classified document to all of you. So please go ahead and take a look at it if you like, and I'd appreciate that.
Well, a huge thank you to not only the wonderful crew at the Spy Museum for hosting this program jointly with the PMML, but to Matthew and to Amanda for such a fascinating discussion. It's always fun when you can have a conversation about something that's so little known and you're getting so much information. So thank you so much. And of course, thank you to everyone who logged in for our discussion this evening. Both the International Spy Museum and the Pritzker Military Museum and Library are open to the public and are hosting a number of exciting programs in the coming months. For information on upcoming Pritzker Military Museum and Library programs, please visit pritzkermilitary.org. Upcoming Spy Museum programs can be found at spymuseum.org. Thank you all, everybody, again, so very much. We hope that you enjoyed this program. We hope to see you all very soon. Have a wonderful evening.